My name is Rachel Lynn. I'm 32 years old, single, and work as an assistant curator at the New England Regional History Museum. I rent a small apartment above a bookstore, have a cat named Echo, and live a life so quiet it practically hums. Some people would call it unremarkable. I call it intentional. I'm also the youngest of 3 siblings. But youngest didn't just mean I came last, it meant I was always on the outside. My sister Emma is the married mother of 2 who lives in the suburbs and sends inspirational group texts no one replies to. My older brother David was the one who took charge after our parents died. He handled the lawyers, the funeral plans, the estate. He spoke at both services, wore tailored suits, and never cried in public. He looked like stability. He sounded like leadership. Most people handed him power without question, and I listened. I noticed. I remembered. People underestimate quiet women. That's fine with me. It lets me see things they don't want seen. Like the time David claimed he was on a business trip to Seattle, but I spotted his car parked behind our father's old fishing cabin. Or when Emma said she'd lost her wedding ring somewhere at the gym, but I found it tucked behind the bathroom sink at Mom's house. I've always had a thing for details. At the museum, I preserve century-old documents and artifacts, most of them forgotten, misfiled, or dismissed as junk. I don't do confrontation. I do facts, patterns, inconsistencies, quiet threads that tie everything together when no one else is paying attention. It's not that I've never been angry. I have, but I don't explode. I take notes. David is 7 years older, and from a young age, he thrived on control. At Dad's funeral, he pulled me aside afterward and said he'd take care of the estate stuff. Then emailed me a so-called summary of the will, no official letterhead, no attorney present. I didn't question it. I just said thanks, not because I trusted him, but because I'd already started noticing things. A phrase in the email that didn't match the lawyer's tone. A missing asset, a timeline that felt too clean. I filed it away, quietly, because with David, nothing is ever casual. It's always calculated. David's accident was sudden, or at least, that's what we were told. A car crash in rural Argentina, middle of the night. No eyewitnesses. The vehicle had veered off a mountain road and caught fire. His body, according to the emailed report from local police, was unrecognizably charred. The official paperwork came through his wife, Michelle, not from a U.S. embassy, not from a consulate, just from her. The funeral was closed casket. Naturally, Michelle handled all the arrangements. She said David had always wanted to be cremated and scattered somewhere quiet and private, so she'd already taken care of it. When I asked where the ashes would be interred, she looked startled just for a second and said she was still deciding. That moment stuck with me. Michelle's grief didn't look like the grief I expected. She didn't cry at the memorial. She gave a short, rehearsed speech, thanked everyone for coming, and avoided eye contact with most of us. Emma chalked it up to shock. I chalked it up to performance. And then there was the speed. The accident happened on a Friday. By the following Thursday, Michelle had already begun probate proceedings. She filed paperwork to transfer joint assets, close accounts, and invoke the life insurance policy. Everything moved with uncanny efficiency, like she had a checklist, like she knew exactly what would happen next. There was also the insurance amount, $8 million. David wasn't known for extravagance. Yet somehow he'd maintained a massive policy Michelle had never once mentioned in casual conversation. And yet, some things didn't add up. David's old email auto-responded with an out-of-office message, one that listed return dates 2 weeks after his supposed death. When I pointed it out, Michelle laughed and said he must have forgotten to update it. Then came the flowers. A delivery showed up at the museum where I worked. White lilies. A simple card with no sender, but the handwriting? It looked familiar. I checked against some old notes David had scribbled years ago during our parents' estate meeting. Same pressure. Same odd loop in the lowercase ig. A week later, I noticed a login alert from a shared streaming account we had used. The IP address pinged from Montreal. David and I had shared that account for years. He was the only one who ever used that particular profile. It had his watch list, his name, and now, apparently, new activity. Then, the final nudge. I received a phone call, unknown number, no voice on the other end, just breathing. It lasted 30 seconds. Whoever it was hung up right as I said David's name. I didn't tell anyone, not yet, but something had shifted in me. Grief is heavy, but what I felt wasn't grief, it was suspicion. And once it took root, it didn't let go. The memorial was held in David and Michelle's backyard, beneath a white tent lined with string lights and rented chairs. It was early spring cool, overcast, with just enough drizzle to keep everyone uncomfortable. The kind of day that makes you feel like something's waiting just beyond the clouds. I sat in the third row, behind Emma and her kids. Michelle stood at the front, holding a microphone in both hands like it might bite. She thanked us all for coming, repeated some well-worn phrases about grief and healing, then quickly handed things off to the officiant. Something about it all felt off, rushed, flat. I scanned the crowd. No one from David's old job, none of his college friends, not even his golf buddies, and they usually showed up for free food and drama. It was like the event had been designed for minimum exposure, like she didn't want too many people asking questions. The officiant gave a short eulogy, vague, generic, and then invited anyone to share memories. No one moved. I glanced at Michelle. Her expression hardened, just slightly, like she didn't want memories, just closure. Official, clean, and quick. That's when I stood up. I didn't plan to. My knees just moved. I walked to the front, took the mic, and stared out over the rows of folding chairs. For a second, I thought about confronting her right there about the flowers, the email, the streaming login, but something stopped me. Not fear, not doubt. Strategy. Instead, I told a story. I talked about David teaching me how to ride a bike, how he ran alongside me down the driveway, barefoot, yelling encouragement, how he caught me when I fell. I kept my voice even, controlled. Then I looked at Michelle. And David, I said slowly, never did like goodbyes. He always left the room quietly, while you were still laughing. There were a few soft chuckles, but Michelle didn't laugh. She just stared at me, her mouth tight. Afterward, as people filtered out, she brushed past me without a word, but her hand shook when she did, and that's when I knew she was hiding something. The funeral wasn't closure, it was cover. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and opened my laptop. I went back through old emails threads from David, especially the ones related to our parents' estate. I wasn't sure what I was looking for at first. Maybe a mistake, a glitch, anything that would justify the feeling crawling under my skin. It didn't take long. There was an email from 6 months ago, one I'd skimmed at the time and forgotten. It included a PDF attachment, a scanned draft of our father's will. But what caught my eye this time was the metadata. The file hadn't been scanned by our father's attorney. It had been scanned from a home printer. The file name included Michelle's initials. Why was Michelle scanning our father's will? That question led to another. The next morning, I called the law firm that handled our parents' estate. I said I was double-checking details for personal records. The assistant on the phone hesitated, but eventually confirmed what I already suspected. There was no amended will filed in their system. The version David had sent, the one that favored Michelle as temporary executor, did not match anything in their records. Now it was more than suspicion. It was evidence. I started making copies. I saved the email, downloaded the attachments, took screenshots, created a folder, encrypted and backed up in the cloud, labeled with a boring name, receipts_Q4. Then I remembered something else. 2 years ago, David had asked me to sign as a witness on a random real estate document, some refinancing thing, he said. At the time, I didn't think twice. But now, I pulled up a photo of the form he'd sent. It wasn't refinancing. It was an authorization letter for a trust fund I didn't even know existed, and my signature was on it. I called Emma that afternoon. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to test the water. Her voice tightened when I mentioned the scanned will. I thought that looked strange, she said quietly, but I didn't want to get involved. That told me 2 things. She had doubts, and she was afraid. I sat back in my chair, heartbeat steady. Whatever game David had started, it had been in motion for a long time, long before the crash, long before the cremation. This wasn't spontaneous. It was layered, strategic, quiet. And suddenly, I wasn't just suspicious. I was certain. A week later, I drove to Boston and paid an unannounced visit to the office of Edward Carr, my parents' former estate attorney. I'd spoken to his assistant before, but I wanted more than polite answers. I wanted facial expressions, pauses, slips. Mr. Carr was older now, gray hair, slightly stooped but still sharp. He remembered me, offered me tea. We made small talk. Then I asked him, as casually as I could, if my father had ever drafted a second will, one that gave David or Michelle more control. His face didn't move, but his fingers tapped once against the folder on his desk. Your father was thorough, he said. The only revisions he ever made were to include a small education fund for Emma's kids. And any role for Michelle? A pause. Michelle wasn't part of the estate. She was never listed. I thanked him and left, but my heart was pounding. That confirmed it. The document David circulated was a forgery, or at the very least, heavily doctored. Back home, I dug deeper. I requested copies of public records tied to David corporate filings. Tax documents, property deeds. Most came back clean, but one LLC, filed 3 months before his death, caught my eye. It was based in Delaware, owned by a trust. The trust had 2 signatories. One was David. The other was me, except I'd never signed anything. The notary listed on the form was someone I didn't recognize. When I called the number, it was disconnected. Now I had forgery, financial manipulation, and my name was being used as a shield. Then came the part I hadn't expected. I searched the business address associated with the trust and found a warehouse in upstate New York. On a whim, I checked the building's security company publicly listed in a recent fire code filing. The security company offered remote surveillance packages. One of the listed users for that building's monitoring system, David Lynn, logged in 2 weeks ago. That's when the floor dropped. If David was dead, how was he still logging into a security system in New York? How was he linked to a trust using my name? How did Michelle act so prepared, so coordinated, unless this had been planned? And most importantly, why use me? Unless I was the best alibi, the unassuming one, the quiet one no one would question. It wasn't just a death, it was a vanishing act. I copied everything, organized it into a hardbound folder, password locked the digital version, made backups. Multiple? This wasn't grief anymore, it was proof. I didn't think anyone had noticed me digging until things started to shift. It began with a phone call at 3:12 a.m. No caller ID, just static on the line. I hung up. 2 nights later, the same thing happened. This time, a voice whispered my name before the line cut out. Not angry, not urgent, just present. A warning. Then, my apartment buzzer rang in the middle of the afternoon while I was at work. My neighbor said a man in a black coat stood at the door for over 10 minutes before walking away. He didn't leave a package, didn't knock, just waited. By the end of the week, someone had tried to access my cloud backup. I got an alert from my security app. 3 failed password attempts from an IP address in New Jersey. I hadn't told anyone about that folder, not even Emma, so someone knew. I decided to test it. That Sunday, I emailed Michelle. Short, casual. I asked how she was holding up and mentioned I'd been revisiting some of the old estate paperwork, just tying up loose ends. Within 2 hours, she replied. Her tone was pleasant, but clipped. She offered to meet in person if I had questions, then added a line I couldn't stop rereading. Let me know if there's anything. Confusing. These matters can look strange when taken out of context. Strange when taken out of context. It wasn't denial, it was suggestion. A day later, Emma called me nervous. I got a message from Michelle, she said. She asked if you were doing okay, if you'd been, quote, under a lot of stress lately. That was it. They were trying to discredit me. The oldest trick. Make the quiet one seem unstable. Isolate her. Make her doubt herself. But I wasn't shaken. I was furious. I started speaking less and listening more. I saved everything. Screenshots. Transcripts. I began printing out key emails and keeping them in a fireproof box. I even backed up my backup and gave a copy to a friend out of town. Then came the last push. I received a letter, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Printed text. Nothing handwritten, just 6 words. Some truths are best left buried. That night, I didn't sleep, but not out of fear. I was awake because for the first time, I knew I was right. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being targeted, and that meant I was getting close. The next day, I found my car keyed. Not random, not juvenile. Just one long, deliberate scratch along the driver's side. It was the kind of message people send when they want you to feel watched. Vulnerable. But I didn't feel vulnerable. I felt focused. I canceled all social plans, changed passwords, installed a door camera. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers and started carrying a pocket recorder. Just in case, I wasn't preparing for paranoia. I was preparing for war. I didn't think anyone had noticed me digging until things started to shift. It began with a phone call at 3:12 a.m. No caller ID, just static on the line. I hung up. 2 nights later, the same thing happened. This time, a voice whispered my name before the line cut out. Not angry, not urgent, just present. A warning. Then, my apartment buzzer rang in the middle of the afternoon while I was at work. My neighbor said a man in a black coat stood at the door for over 10 minutes before walking away. He didn't leave a package, didn't knock, just waited. By the end of the week, someone had tried to access my cloud backup. I got an alert from my security app. 3 failed password attempts from an IP address in New Jersey. I hadn't told anyone about that folder, not even Emma. So someone knew. I decided to test it. That Sunday, I emailed Michelle. Short, casual. I asked how she was holding up and mentioned I'd been revisiting some of the old estate paperwork, just tying up loose ends. Within 2 hours, she replied. Her tone was pleasant, but clipped. She offered to meet in person if I had questions, then added a line I couldn't stop rereading. Let me know if there's anything. Confusing. These matters can look strange when taken out of context. Strange when taken out of context. It wasn't denial. It was suggestion. A day later, Emma called me nervous. I got a message from Michelle, she said. She asked if you were doing okay, if you'd been, quote, under a lot of stress lately. That was it. They were trying to discredit me. The oldest trick. Make the quiet one seem unstable. Isolate her. Make her doubt herself. But I wasn't shaken. I was furious. I started speaking less and listening more. I saved everything. Screenshots. Transcripts. I began printing out key emails and keeping them in a fireproof box. I even backed up my backup and gave a copy to a friend out of town. Then came the last push. I received a letter, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Printed text. Nothing handwritten, just 6 words. Some truths are best left buried. That night, I didn't sleep, but not out of fear. I was awake because for the first time, I knew I was right. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being targeted, and that meant I was getting close. The next day, I found my car keyed. Not random, not juvenile. Just one long, deliberate scratch along the driver's side. It was the kind of message people send when they want you to feel watched, vulnerable. But I didn't feel vulnerable. I felt focused. I canceled all social plans, changed passwords, installed a door camera. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers and started carrying a pocket recorder. Just in case. I wasn't preparing for paranoia. I was preparing for war. I filed a police report not because I thought it would lead to anything, but because I wanted a paper trail. If someone tried to twist my story later, I'd have dates, details, receipts. Even if the system ignored me, I'd be harder to erase. And in the back of my mind, one question began to echo louder each day. If they're willing to scare me, what else are they willing to do? 3 weeks after the memorial, I booked a rental car and drove 6 hours north to the warehouse listed in the Delaware trust filings. It sat in an industrial strip just outside Albany, low-slung, windowless, and nondescript, a perfect place to disappear into. The building looked empty. No signage, no activity. But through a crack in the side gate, I saw tire marks, fresh ones leading to a rear loading bay. I snapped photos. Then I parked 2 blocks away, changed into plain clothes, and walked back, just to look, just to feel the air around it. The security system was real. Cameras mounted at all corners, motion sensors on the side walls. I recognized the brand one David and I had installed at our parents' old vacation home years ago. He liked tech. He liked control. I didn't try to break in. That wasn't the plan. Instead, I followed the paper, using the trust registration number. I traced its financial activity through a commercial data aggregator. A few dead ends. But then one flagged transaction, a monthly payment to a shell consulting firm, listed as operations oversight. The recipient, a bank account registered in Quebec, Montreal, the same city where David's Netflix profile had logged in 2 weeks earlier. The pieces started forming something sharp. David wasn't just hiding. He was managing something, remotely, quietly, through aliases and proxies, the fake will, the trust. The LLCs, they were all part of an infrastructure, a structure that required maintenance, updates, surveillance. He wasn't gone. He was working. I called Emma again, this time. I didn't hold back. I told her everything: the warehouse, the trust, the forged will, the login. At first, she was quiet. Then she said something I hadn't expected. I got a call from him 2 days after the funeral. My breath stopped. What? He didn't say it was him, but I knew the voice. He asked if I was okay, said not to ask questions, that it was safer. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want to believe it. And I was scared. It clicked, then Michelle wasn't acting alone. She was the front, the executor, but David was pulling the strings, watching everything, including us. I asked Emma for the call log. She sent a screenshot. The number had a Montreal area code. Now I had confirmation, proof, voice, location, motive. But I needed more. I needed someone on the inside. That's when I remembered Linda Morrow. She'd worked for David for years, his executive assistant when he was running his consulting firm before he died. I found her LinkedIn profile, inactive for months, but her email still worked. I wrote her a message. Linda, I believe David is alive. I don't want revenge. I want answers. If you've ever questioned what happened, please talk to me. Off the record. No threats, just the truth. She didn't reply that day, or the next. But on the 3rd day, she sent a 3-word email. You're not wrong. Attached was a PDF. It looked like a travel manifest private jet routing from Buffalo to Vancouver. Dated 4 days before the reported accident in Argentina. Passenger, Daniel Lincroft, a name David used for real estate flips. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes. This wasn't just a faked death. It was an exit strategy, one planned with precision, tested under aliases, buried beneath shell companies and manipulated grief. It wasn't just about hiding, it was about securing control, eliminating liabilities, and anyone who might question him. He'd either pay off, discredit, or erase. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to wait for him to make another move. I was going to bring him out. On my terms. I didn't rush it. When you're going up against someone who faked their own death, staged an international exit, and weaponized grief, you don't swing wildly. You move like a surgeon, quiet, precise, clean. First, I made a list, an actual pen and paper list of every piece of verifiable evidence I had. The forged will, the shell trust with my forged signature, the surveillance login from Montreal, the warehouse photos, the travel manifest Linda sent, Emma's call log, an account of the voice she recognized. Then I made a second list, people I could trust. It was shorter than I'd hoped. Emma, maybe Linda, tentatively, a college friend who now worked in digital forensics. He owed me a favor. That was it. I started with digital security. My friend helped me encrypt my backups and create a mirrored drive that would auto-upload to a cloud server in Switzerland. If anything happened to me, the folder would unlock and forward to 2 attorneys and 1 journalist. Not dramatic, just smart. Next came narrative control. David had used manipulation and control to rewrite the family story. I wasn't going to play that game. I was going to document, timestamp, organize. I created a dossier, not just a pile of evidence, but a cohesive narrative, a story with dates, signatures, audio clips, screenshots, voice matches. It wasn't flashy, it was airtight. Then I reached out to Linda again. I asked for one more thing, internal company emails. She didn't disappoint. She forwarded me a string of messages between David and a logistics partner coded language. But the timeline matched his disappearance. It also referenced a secondary fund to support transition risk. He was paying people off, including Michelle. Now I had leverage. I drafted a letter, not to Michelle, to David. I wrote it in plain language, calm, controlled. I told him I knew, that I had enough to expose the entire operation, that I hadn't acted yet not because I was afraid, but because I wanted him to see the value in walking away before things got public. You've built a second life. I wrote, burn the bridge and walk cleanly. Try to erase me, and I'll be the one fire you can't smother. I didn't sign it. I just left a phone number, a burner I bought the same day. I mailed the letter to the Montreal address linked to his trust. Then I waited. In the meantime, I contacted a small investigative podcast that had recently blown open a money laundering ring involving a hedge fund CEO. I pitched my story anonymized, but specific enough to raise interest. They agreed to a background call. I didn't share the files yet, but I gave them just enough to stay interested. 2 days later, the burner rang. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. 8 seconds. I see you haven't changed. Still playing quiet games? Let's talk. No name, no callback number. But it was his voice, and he sounded nervous. That was the crack I needed. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was in control, so I made one more move quietly, strategically. I hired a private investigator, someone independent, out of state. I gave her the basics and asked her to confirm 2 things. Was David still in Canada? And who was handling his finances on the ground? She promised a report in 10 days. I told her she had 5, because now I wasn't just planning. I was baiting him, and soon he'd walk right into it. It started with a press release. I knew David hated publicity. He built his power in shadows, behind shell entities and dead-end email addresses. So I flipped the script. I sent an anonymous tip to a local Montreal business journal, linking David's trust, the warehouse, and the LLC to questionable asset transfers. They didn't run a headline, but they published a small item online enough to stir interest. That same morning, I uploaded the dossier. It didn't go to police. Not yet. It went to a journalist at the podcast, encrypted and tagged with a single phrase. If I disappear, publish everything. She confirmed receipt within minutes. Then I waited. The private investigator came through that afternoon. She sent a short report. David was using a false ID, Daniel Lincroft, but facial recognition matched him with 99% certainty. He lived in a townhouse on the outskirts of Montreal. Rarely left, but had regular deliveries and visits from a man linked to offshore finance firms. That was enough. I printed 3 copies of the full dossier, one for a corporate crime investigator in New York, one for a regulatory official in Canada, and one for a lawyer I trusted. I also mailed an abbreviated version, no name, no return address, to Michelle's office. Then I booked a flight to Montreal. I didn't go there to confront him. I went to watch him watch the fallout. At 3:17 p.m., the Journal posted a follow-up, a longer piece. It tied the trust and shell accounts to several real estate holdings. It stopped short of naming names, but the pieces were there for anyone who looked closely. David did. At 5:43 p.m., the burner phone rang again. What do you want? His voice was cold, flat, not afraid controlled, but less polished, like someone playing catch-up. I want you to know I'm not bluffing. He was quiet for a moment. Do you think you're safe? I didn't answer. I just ended the call. Then I texted the podcast journalist. Green light. What followed wasn't fire and fury. It was silence. Michelle's firm issued a vague legal notice citing privacy violations and unauthorized data use. But it didn't stop the journalist. The episode went live that Friday. It didn't say his name, but it laid out the infrastructure. The forgeries, the fake death, the layers. Within hours, the silence broke. A lawyer representing an anonymous client contacted the journalist, asking for clarification on certain claims. The warehouse suddenly listed for sale. The offshore entities began dissolving. Emma told me Michelle stopped returning calls. And then came the final confirmation. I received a package. No return address. Inside, a burner phone, powered on. One text message appeared on the screen. You win. No apology. No explanation. Just 2 words. And I was still standing. 2 words. Simple. Final. but not enough. I didn't want a truce. I wanted closure. So I made one last move, measured, public, and irreversible. I submitted a formal complaint to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre, attaching the dossier and a notarized statement. I copied it to a cross-border task force that had worked with financial crimes involving shell companies. And then, just to be sure, I sent the same package to an independent watchdog group focused on offshore laundering schemes. I wasn't naive. I knew investigations took time, but time wasn't my concern anymore. It was momentum, exposure. I wanted his systems to unravel piece by piece faster than he could contain them. And that's exactly what started happening. 2 weeks later, I got word from the journalist. A Canadian regulatory agency had issued a quiet freeze on assets connected to the Delaware Trust. Days after that, Michelle's legal team withdrew their vague threat. They didn't want discovery. They didn't want questions. They didn't want exposure. Then Linda messaged me again. He's gone. Vanished from Montreal. Not even his lawyer knows where. But I didn't need to know where David was anymore. Because I had taken everything he tried to hide behind. I'd ripped off the veil, thread by thread. He could change names, locations, identities. But the story was out there now. Stamped, dated, traced. He couldn't scrub the internet. He couldn't unring the bell. And then came the call I hadn't expected. It was from a woman named Carla, a paralegal from a firm in Toronto. She said she'd been asked to locate me regarding a will update dated 3 years before David's death. A secondary version, filed separately, naming me as contingent trustee for our father's holdings. I had been cut out only to be written back in again. David had tried to override it with forged revisions. But now that the fraud was exposed, the original stood. The estate was reopened. I wasn't just vindicated. I was reinstated. I flew to Toronto for the formal review. Emma joined me. She sat next to me as the paperwork was read aloud. Her hand found mine halfway through the hearing and didn't let go. There were no cameras, no media, just ink, paper. And the truth? My attorney called it poetic. I just called it justice. That night, I sat alone on my porch, the burner phone turned off beside me, and whispered those 2 words back into the dark. You lose. A week after the hearing, I received an email from a name I didn't recognize. It was from a senior partner at a legal consultancy firm that specialized in estate transitions and white-collar recovery. Their message was short and respectful. They had been following the podcast, reading between the lines, quietly verifying facts. Then came the offer. They wanted me to consult on an internal investigation, one involving suspicious activity inside a family-run investment firm. The parallels, they said, were striking. Forged signatures, questionable trusts, an estate in dispute. They didn't want a lawyer. They wanted a pattern analyst, someone who could see the gaps in stories and the threads between lies. Someone like me? I stared at the message for a long time, not because I didn't believe it, but because it was the first time anyone had acknowledged what this experience had made of me. Not just a survivor, not just the girl who caught her brother faking his own death, but a force. I forwarded the message to my attorney. We scheduled a call, and then I replied, "I'm listening." That night, Emma dropped by unannounced. We shared a bottle of wine on my porch. No talking for a while. Just silence. Not the heavy kind. The earned kind. Eventually, she looked over and said, "You know you could do this for real, right? This kind of work." I smiled. I already am. And for the first time in months, I let the quiet feel like peace, not warning. Opportunity had knocked. And this time, I was ready. The offer sat in my inbox for 3 days before I opened it again. Not because I wasn't interested, but because I needed to be sure I was saying yes for the right reason, not out of spite or ego or some need to keep chasing ghosts. I made a list. Pros and cons, risks and freedoms. I asked myself if I was stepping into another version of the same game David had played, just with different rules and players. But the truth was simpler than that. I liked seeing through walls people built to hide bad things. I liked unraveling threads no one else noticed. And most of all, I liked that the skills I had developed quietly, painfully, could actually protect someone else. So I said yes, on one condition. I wouldn't work full-time. I wouldn't relocate. I'd consult on my terms, from where I lived. And only when I believed in the case, they agreed without hesitation. It wasn't about power. It was about precision. I wasn't trying to become someone new. I was simply owning who I had become. At dinner that week, Emma raised a toast. "To new beginnings," she said. I added, "To quiet revenge." We both laughed. After she left, I walked into my office and opened the drawer where I kept the burner phone. I turned it on, just once, to check. No new messages. I smiled and powered it down for good. This wasn't a war anymore. It was a choice, and I had finally made mine. Spring came late that year. The trees outside my window were just beginning to bloom soft greens, stubborn buds pushing through gray. The world looked like it was exhaling after a long winter. And for once, I felt in rhythm with it. I kept the burner phone locked in a drawer, but never fully forgot it. Not because I was waiting, but because it reminded me of what it cost to see clearly, what it takes to refuse silence, what it means to own your story. One morning, I opened my email to find a message from someone I didn't know. A woman from Nevada. Her brother had manipulated their family's estate. She'd heard my story on the podcast and wanted to ask, "How did you know where to begin?" I didn't answer right away. I sat with the question. Then I wrote, "You start when something doesn't sit right, and then you don't let it go." That was it. No grand statement, just a truth I'd learned the hard way. I turned off the lamp, stepped out onto the porch, and watched the wind carry petals across the street. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not closure, not revenge, not even justice, just the quiet. And this time, it belonged to me.